My father's laugh echoed in the grand hall, a booming sound of pure satisfaction. Then it froze, cracking in his throat. The best man was on his feet, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze locked on my father. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through every other sound in the room. "Colonel Jensen, sir. With all due respect, you're mistaken." A heavy silence fell across the polished tables. "That's Major Sharma. She commands us." As if pulled by a single invisible string, the other groomsmen rose in perfect unison, their casual suits suddenly taking on the weight of a uniform. My father's jaw went slack, his entire world, his carefully constructed hierarchy, fracturing right before his eyes. But that moment of stunning clarity came later. 2 hours earlier I was just trying to make myself as small as possible, a ghost at the feast. The air was thick with the scent of expensive flowers and quiet money, a world I orbited but never truly entered. I watched my brother, David, the family's golden boy, basking in the glow of marrying into a wealthy, influential family. Then I saw him coming towards me. It was my father, Robert, a retired Army colonel who lived his life as if he never left the service, dragging the groom's powerful CEO father along with him. My stomach tightened. I knew this performance. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his voice slick with scotch and false charm. "And this," he announced with a grand, dismissive wave, "is my failure of a child, the fat one." He said it with a wink, as if sharing a beloved family punchline. A few cruel chuckles rippled from the nearby relatives, while the CEO just offered a tight, uncomfortable smile. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but my face remained a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. It was a skill I had perfected over a lifetime of similar moments. The academic awards dismissed with a pat on the head, the constant comparisons to David's, effortless social victories, the casual way my ambitions were treated as a quaint hobby. Inside, a cold, quiet fury began to solidify. He saw a disappointment, a prop to make his perfect son look even better. He didn't see the woman who had led teams through situations he could only read about in heavily redacted government reports. He had no concept of the authority I wielded or the respect I had earned with blood and sweat, not inherited through a name. He just saw the same overweight, awkward daughter he'd always chosen to see, and he thought it was hilarious. He laughed, thinking it was just another tired insult I'd have to swallow. He had no idea he'd just belittled his daughter in front of the only men on earth who had followed her through hell and back. To understand the reckoning that was about to unfold, you have to understand the 2 lives I was forced to live. To them, I was Anya the admin, a safe, boring government employee with a decent pension plan and a job title so vague it invited no follow-up questions. This narrative was cemented at a family dinner a few months before the wedding. The entire evening was an altar built to my brother David, who had just been promoted to senior marketing manager. My father, Robert, was holding court, popping a bottle of champagne that had probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He lauded David's killer instinct and boardroom savvy, painting a picture of a corporate warrior slaying dragons in the form of quarterly reports. It was all so theatrical. During a lull in the worship, I quietly mentioned I had some news of my own. I had recently been awarded the Bronze Star. A heavy silence fell over the table, the kind that happens when someone says something awkward that no one knows how to respond to. My father finally broke it with a condescending pat on my hand. "That's nice, sweetie," he said, his voice dripping with dismissive pride. "They give those out for good paperwork now, don't they? Not like in my day, when you really had to earn it." He chuckled, and David joined in. The story was set. David was the warrior, and I was the glorified secretary. Anya the admin. It felt like he was branding me with the words. My mother, Helen, a woman whose entire life was a masterclass in avoiding conflict, leaned over and whispered to me, "Just let your father have this, Anya. David's life is so much more visible. He needs the encouragement." I just nodded, the weight of the actual metal feeling impossibly heavy in my memory. I didn't see paperwork when I thought of it. I saw the faces of my team, the dust and the fear, and the split-second decision that had prevented a catastrophic failure. but telling them that would have been like trying to describe the color blue to someone who could only see in shades of gray. It was a language they simply refused to learn. But Anya the admin didn't exist in my other world, my real world. In that world, my name was Valkyrie. My reality wasn't a brightly lit dining room, it was the cold, sterile darkness of a tactical operations center, the only light coming from the green and blue glow of a dozen monitors. There, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like the calm, steady center of a storm. I remember a training exercise that had gone sideways, the simulated stakes feeling terrifyingly real. The air in the TOC was thick with tension, a palpable thing you could almost taste. The radio crackled to life, the voice of my lead team sergeant, strained and urgent. Valkyrie, this is Odin 1. We have 0 visual on the target building, repeat, 0 vis. The sandstorm is kicking up something fierce. Requesting permission to deploy microdrone for ISR. My eyes scanned the topographical maps, the intelligence reports, the weather data flashing across my screen. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The intel said the building was structurally sound, but a secondary report, buried 3 layers deep, noted seismic instability in the region. The drone would give them eyes, yes, but its vibration could be just enough to... I made the call. Odin 1, negative, I said, my voice calm and even, cutting through the static. Intel says the structure is compromised. Your route is unstable. Reroute to extraction point Bravo. We are scrubbed. Acknowledge. There was a moment of silence on the other end, a moment where he was weighing my command against what his own eyes were telling him. Then his voice came back, clear and professional. Solid copy, Valkyrie. Rerouting to Bravo now. I leaned back in my chair, the tension slowly draining from my shoulders. My sergeant major, the man who would later be my brother's best man sergeant, Major Evans, caught my eye from across the room and gave me a single, slow nod. It was a small gesture, but it was a universe of respect. A post-action report later confirmed the building's foundation would have collapsed. I had just saved his entire team. Those men, the groomsmen, they weren't just my work friends. They were my responsibility. They were my team. The only person who saw both of my worlds clearly was my cousin. My cousin Sarah, a tech startup founder who understood that a person's value wasn't determined by their family's opinion, was my one true confidant. We had a video call the week before the wedding, her face looking worried on my laptop screen. Are you sure about this, Anya? Going to this thing? You know how they get. Your dad will hold court, your mom will try to keep the peace, and David will soak it all up. She was right, of course. She'd witnessed it her whole life. He's my brother, I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. And my team is coming with me as guests. It'll be fine. I can handle it. She didn't look convinced, her brow furrowed with the skepticism of someone who knew my family's playbook by heart. I just wanted to be normal for one weekend, Sarah, I admitted. I just want to be a sister at her brother's wedding. It was a foolish hope, a denial of a pattern that had been set in stone for decades. I thought I could contain the 2 halves of my life, keeping them perfectly separate as I always had. For 10 years, I had kept my world separate to keep the peace. I let them believe their narrative. But after that insult, in front of my men, I realized peace was no longer an option. Protocol would have to be observed. As the last cruel chuckle died down, I didn't scream. I didn't cry or storm out of the room. I simply picked up my glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid was a shock to my system, a grounding force that cleared the emotional fog. In my mind, a switch flipped. The part of me that was a daughter receded, and the part of me that was a commander took over. This was no longer a family dinner. It was an active engagement. The objective was not revenge. Revenge is messy and emotional. This was to be a field correction. My father's narrative was a breach of protocol that had to be contained, publicly and decisively. My eyes scanned the room, landing for a brief second on my brother, David. I remembered his frantic phone call just a week before, his voice tight with anxiety as he begged me to make sure my work friends behaved themselves. They had all promised they would, and they were blending in seamlessly in their well-fitted suits, looking more like successful businessmen than the lethal soldiers they were. This wasn't a premeditated strategy. It was something far more ingrained. It was instinct. I looked across the opulent room and found the calm, steady gaze of Sergeant Major Evans. I held his eyes for no more than a second, giving him a look we had perfected in the crowded markets of hostile territories. It was not a nod or a wink. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in my expression, a non-verbal cue that carried a clear and urgent message, threat identified. Stand by for my signal. He gave no outward reaction, not even a flicker of an eyelid, but I knew he had received and understood. The trap was now set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The entire strategy hinged on the one thing my father held more sacred than anything: the rigid structure of military custom. He was a retired colonel, an 06. I am an active duty major, an 04. In his world, on paper, he outranked me for life. He saw my rank as a lesser version of his own, a stepping stone he had long since passed. But he was ignorant of the crucial detail, the one part of my career I never shared. My command wasn't in a traditional brigade, it was within a classified joint service task force. In that operational sphere, my authority was absolute, and the loyalty of my men was to their current commander, not to a retired officer telling war stories at a rehearsal dinner. My father lived his life by the book, the Army Field Manual. He just never imagined I had read it closer than he had. He was about to get a lesson in customs and courtesies he'd never forget, delivered by the very men he thought were just my office buddies. The moment arrived as I knew it would, disguised as a toast. My father stood, tapping a fork against his champagne flute, a self-satisfied smile plastered on his face. The opulent ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and hushed elegance became his personal stage. He began by lavishing praise on my brother David, recounting exaggerated tales of his own business acumen, cleverly positioning David as the heir to a legacy of greatness. He was trying to impress the groom's father, the CEO, and he was using my brother as his proxy. I felt my men, my groomsmen, tense up around me, their quiet disapproval, a stark contrast to the polite applause from the other guests. Then, as he wound down his speech, he turned his attention to me. It was the final act of his performance. To my son David, who followed in my footsteps of success, he boomed, raising his glass. And to Anya, who, well, she's here too. We're all proud of her, in her own way. The words hung in the air, a public declaration of my status as an afterthought. The applause was strained, hesitant. A few people looked at me with pity, which was somehow worse than the mockery. My father, basking in the spotlight, wasn't finished. He looked directly at me, his smile unwavering. "Stand up, sweetie. Let them see you." That was it. That was the signal. It wasn't a request. It was a command from an officer who believed he still held rank over me. It was meant to be the final, casual humiliation. But I remained seated. I held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, I gave Sergeant Major Evans the barest of nods. His eyes, sharp and perceptive, acknowledged the order. The time for quiet endurance was over. The field correction was now in motion. Sergeant Major Evans stood up. His movement was fluid and economical, drawing every eye in the room. The murmuring that had filled the space after the toast died instantly. His voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that my father's booming performance had lacked. "Colonel Jensen, sir." The use of his rank was a deliberate, calculated strike, a sign of respect that was simultaneously a weapon. My father looked momentarily confused, his smile faltering. Then, as one, the other 6 groomsmen stood, silent shadows rising from their chairs. Their posture shifted, their relaxed demeanor vanishing, replaced by the rigid, disciplined bearing of soldiers. A thick, tense silence descended upon the room. "Sir, with all due respect," Evans continued, his voice as steady as granite, "you're mistaken about your daughter's contribution." My father's face began to tighten, the blood draining from it. Excuse me?" he managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. Evans didn't flinch. "We are the groomsmen because David is our brother in arms, but we are here because of her." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. That's Major Anya Sharma. She commands us. The two words, Major, commands, hit the room like a shockwave. Before my father could even process the information, another groomsman, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, spoke up. His voice was quieter, but laced with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Sir, we are Task Force Odin. We followed Major Sharma into the Korangal Valley. A few audible gasps came from guests who recognized the infamous name. The paperwork she got a bronze star for, Kenji said, locking eyes with my father, was coordinating. The casevac that saved my life, and the lives of the two men standing right next to me. The insult, the casual dismissal of my medal, was not just corrected. It was annihilated with irrefutable, life-and-death truth. Evans stepped in to deliver the final, devastating blow. Your clearance was never high enough to know her mission, sir. But every man in this room owes her his life. He looked around at the stunned faces, his gaze finally settling back on my father. She is Valkyrie, and we would follow her anywhere. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and noise out of the grand ballroom. My father stood there, white as a sheet, his body locked in a rigid, involuntary posture of attention. His training, his very bones, betrayed his ego. He was a subordinate being dressed down by a senior NCO, and he couldn't stop it. The groom's CEO father was staring at me, his eyes wide with a dawning profound respect. He wasn't looking at a failure, he was looking at a leader. And my brother, David. He looked utterly lost, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger who had just appeared in his sister's chair. For the first time in his life, he was seeing me. For my entire life, my father had demanded respect based on the rank he used to hold. In 30 seconds, my men had shown him that true authority isn't worn on a uniform, it's earned in the field. The silence that followed their declaration was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all the whispers and polite chatter of the evening. My father didn't yell or argue, he simply collapsed back into his chair, the arrogant, commanding posture he had worn his entire life deflating out of him like air from a balloon. He looked small. For the rest of the evening, the entire dynamic of the room had been rewritten. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the pity case at the edge of the frame. I was a gravitational center. The groom's influential father, the CEO my own father had been so desperate to impress, approached me, his hand extended. His handshake was firm, his eyes filled not with curiosity, but with a deep, analytical respect. Major, he said, his voice low. My company works on DoD contracts. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on leadership sometime. My men, my team, formed a quiet protective circle around me. They didn't make a big show of it, but their presence was a clear and solid barrier. Their mission for the evening, it seemed, was complete. Later, as people began to leave, my brother David finally approached me. His face was a wreck of confusion, shame, and a dawning horror at his own lifelong ignorance. Anya, he stammered, his eyes unable to meet mine. I had no idea. I looked at him, at the golden boy whose shine had been built, in part, on my shadow. There was no anger left in me, no desire for a groveling apology. There was only a calm, quiet finality. I know, I said. A year can change everything. A year later, I was standing at a podium, the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel pinned to my collar. My new office overlooked a vast training ground where the next generation of leaders was being forged. I was their commander. As I addressed the auditorium full of new officers, my voice was steady and clear, filled with a confidence that wasn't performed but earned. I spoke about the true nature of authority, about how it isn't taken, but given, entrusted to you by the people who depend on your judgment. I moved with an unshakable sense of purpose, because I was no longer living two lives. I was finally, wholly myself. My promotion wasn't celebrated at a stuffy dinner with my blood relatives. It was celebrated at a backyard barbecue, surrounded by the smell of grilled burgers and the sounds of children laughing. This was my true family. Sergeant Major Evans, with his own family in tow, handed me a cold beer, a wide, proud grin on his face. Proud of you, boss, he said. and the simple title meant more to me than any formal address. His wife gave me a warm hug, and his kids treated me like a favorite aunt. I was surrounded by the men I'd led, and the families they had come home to. A circle of genuine affection built on shared risk and mutual respect. In the middle of a laughing conversation, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a little annoyed at the interruption. The name on the screen was Father. I opened the text message, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady. The message was formal, stilted. Lieutenant Colonel Sharma. I saw the announcement on the base website. Your mother and I was wrong. I am proud of you. I read the words once, then a second time. A younger version of myself would have burst into tears, either of rage or of relief. A younger version of me would have felt a surge of vindictive triumph. But now, I felt a quiet stillness. It was no longer an apology I needed. It was simply a piece of corrected intel, a final entry in a logbook that was now closed. His validation was no longer a required asset for my life's mission. With a calm, steady thumb, I pressed archive. I put the phone back in my pocket and turned to my friends, a small, peaceful smile on my face as I rejoined the laughter. I was finally home. My father believed a legacy was a name you pass down. I learned that a true legacy is the call sign your people give you when they trust you with their lives. If you've ever had your strength underestimated by the people who should have known better, tell us your story in the comments. Here, your command is always respected.